All right. I'm very excited to introduce Cherlene Tay, who's the Manager of Validation and Verification at the Digital Governance Council, a Canadian standards development organization accredited by the Standards Council of Canada to publish national digital governance standards. Throughout her past 8 years of working at the council and consulting at KPMG, she has provided governance, risk management, and compliance expertise to government bodies, regulatory agencies, and the Zoom box is in the way, and nonprofit organizations. She has led numerous consultations with subject matter experts to develop national standards of Canada on artificial intelligence ethics, data governance, cybersecurity, as well as age assurance technologies. She also manages the operationalization of the Council's validation and verification program, which audits and reviews organizations against digital governance standards. I'm gonna share.
Is this good for everyone?
Yeah, and I'm gonna give you this. Is this good enough? Okay.
Okay, slides are working. Hello, everyone. I realized I didn't say what I'm grateful for. I'm Cherlene, and I'm grateful for my recent trip to Peru. So I just came back a week ago, and the mountains were just really beautiful when I did my hike. So I'm extremely grateful for that. Is there a way of making this? Oh, no. Louder. Taller? Oh. No? That's okay. I will bend down, don't mind me. But thank you so much for that introduction. Just to start, I guess I just wanted to get a sense from this room. How many of you are familiar with how standards are developed in Canada? Okay, we have one person. I saw another hand there, but this is good because this is exactly why I'm here. I do want to raise awareness about how the process works and how you all can also get involved. So believe it or not, I don't think it was in my bio, but I actually came more from a business background. And then I moved into consulting. And specifically, I think the area of digital policy and risk management really stuck out to me. And so that's where I started moving my career trajectory into. And so it's been the past 2 years here at the council, and I focus mainly in terms of the policy in the digital governance space, specifically in Canada. So if there are, three main takeaways that you get from today, I think it really is up here. The way standards really shape and reduce risk to Canadians in the digital governance space would be standards strengthen transparency, they strengthen accountability, and also they are very effective policy levers. So I think before I go there, I just wanted to introduce the organization. So I say I come from the Digital Governance Council, but the Digital Governance Standards Institute is actually the standards development branch of the council. So what you see here is that, yes, we are an accredited standards development organization. So there is a federal crown corporation called the Standards Council of Canada, and they accredit us alongside a whole bunch of other standards development organizations to build out standards. So if you look at your household appliances at home, your refrigerators, you know that they comply with a specific set of safety standards. We are sort of the equivalent, and so if you've heard of ISO IEC standards or the National Institute of Science and Technology in the US, like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, these are sort of equivalents of what we do at the DGSI when it comes to building out standards, specifically in digital tech. So at the core, I think the main thing about standards are that it's a very agile mechanism that really helps to accelerate policy, especially when sometimes when it comes to law and regulation, it can take a long time. And so standards are sort of this like short-term mechanism that can be used by policymakers, but also public institutions as well. So a little bit about how the process works. So these are the steps in every standards development process for every specific accredited SDO, standards development organization. So this is where you folks can get involved because when it comes to the proposal stage, just right from the get-go, anyone can put forward a proposal. So we have had a whole bunch of standards arise because a lot of people in the academia space or the government space actually come to us saying, hey, I think there's a strategic need in Canada for a specific standard to be built out domestically in the area of digital governance. And so then this proposal gets put forth to our standards policy committee, and then it goes through a multi-stakeholder participation process when it comes to drafting. So we do have this mandated criteria that we have to follow in order to continue being accredited. And that means that we need balanced delegations from governments, regulators, industry, civil society, and academics. And also not just that, we do need representation from across Canada as well. A good part of, I think, the public review stage is even though the drafts of the standard are available 24/7 throughout the entire life cycle, we are specifically mandated to have a 60-day public review stage where we do solicit review comments from the public. And then following that, we have our committee approval stage. So at this stage, it is a deliberate rules-based process. And again, if you remember what I just said about the balanced interest from all the different groups, we do need that balanced vote as well before the standard is finally approved as a national standard. And then when it is published, it is reaffirmed, revised, or withdrawn. So the real point of this is because when it comes to digital policy, things are evolving so quickly in a matter of months, sometimes even days. And so when it comes to the strategic need, maybe in a few years or every 2 years, we determine that there is not actually a need for this standard anymore. This is where we would withdraw the standard. Or there are so many significant changes that we do think the standard needs to be revised. In this case, we gather the whole technical committee again, and then we gather all these experts to put in their feedback so that we can update the standard. And then lastly, they are available bilingually at no cost. So these are the 3 main use cases when it comes to transparency, accountability, and policy levers. Transparency really comes into mind and when I think about voting. And so this was why I chose it as a use case for this criteria, I would say. We do have a few standards specifically collaborating with the municipal government to do online voting regulation. And then when it comes to accountability, I thought very much so of protecting minors when it comes to, age-appropriate websites. And so this is the use case that I decided to talk about for accountability that I will also go into more detail. And then lastly, when it comes to policy levers with data governance, specifically, this is a very new standard actually that we just published early last month. And this is a standard on data governance specifically for community and human services. So with that, online voting, first of all. So this one really emerged from 2 professors. So again, academia was kind of that baseline to start that proposal, but it came from a professor in computer science, actually a bunch of professors in computer science as well as professors in political science. And they felt that when it came to online voting, specifically they wanted to focus on municipalities, but they really felt like there was a need to establish some baseline for there to be requirements in online voting technology because there wasn't something like that in Canada. And so they decided to gather a bunch of folks, not just academia, but also reached into our own networks and talked to government people as well, and also online technology or online voting technology vendors to make sure that we really got, a good breadth of people in our technical committee. And so this was really good because even recently in recent municipal elections, more and more municipalities have started to actually put the standard into the RFP. And so they have said, okay, if you want to be an online voting technology vendor for us, then you need to show that you at least comply with these requirements in the standard. And then it really helps online voting providers as well, because previously there wasn't really a framework. There were in other countries, but when it came to Canada specific, it's really helpful when you know that municipalities have already looked through this standard and say, okay, these are the requirements that they want. And so this was also helpful for the voting providers to use it to assess their own practices and their own technologies. So when it came to the actual scope of the standard, this standard really specifies the technical requirements for voting services, but it's interesting because it's not just online voting technology requirements. There's also a second part, which is more for municipalities at the administration level. So think of it as the section A being the tech side, and then section B being things like what is the staffing levels that you need at your municipality if you want to use online voting tech. And this is really important because a lot of municipalities are relatively understaffed sometimes, or they might not have the specific expertise to even, administrate these technologies. So the fact that they have to follow certain requirements in this section really helps them too. And I kind of listed out these 4 bullet points when it came to considerations for these voting texts. But I think mainly we wanted to focus on security and privacy, which is why when I talk about transparency, I think a lot of voters want to make sure that, well, first of all, their vote is protected, but also that they want to make sure that their personal information is not being divulged as well. And so a lot of considerations were given to this specific criteria. And this standard really took a long time. Like, I think it was one of the more controversial standards, if I say so, because I feel like there was so much back and forth from the academia side, the government side, the voting tech vendor side. No one wanted a standard that was too hard to comply with, or else that would also reduce accessibility when it came to the technology vendors wanting to provide that tech. And then you also have some government pushback sometimes because you don't want something that's also kind of a burden on you administratively. And then some other requirements here that I mentioned too, when it came to personal computational capacities, I think at the administration level, at the municipality level, that was also really important. And then typical like system auditability, things like how you want to make sure that your logs can actually be audited after the vote, that was really key when it came to the validity of the vote. There was a lot of debate just on the term of validity of a vote. And so this is really the use case that I chose for transparency, because I think when it came to online voting, I think that really set the stage in terms of how standards can be used to strengthen transparency, specifically to the public. The next one would be around accountability. So this is a spicy one, because when it came to the development of the standard, like we did have a whole bunch of different institutions come to us too. And specifically, there were also the producers of these age-inappropriate websites that also wanted to be a part of it. Obviously, there were also people that were more lobbyist side. And so there were just like a lot of different opinions in terms of how stringent, again, they want the standard to be. And this really came about actually from a PhD candidate, and he was from computer science. And so I think it's interesting because I think a bunch of you might be also from that space. I've been to civic tech events in the past as well. It was at the different location, it was at City Hall. And so this room is just so much brighter and so much more spacious, which is great. But I do recall talking a lot to people from the computer science too. And I felt like it's a good reminder, I think, that even people coming from a very technical background can also play a part when it came to more like civic participation roles. But really this standard, CAN DGSI 127, it came about because of this bill S210 that introduced age verification to restrict young persons' online access to adult material. And that's why I say it was kind of controversial, because even this bill in itself, that was where the standard stemmed from, was very controversial. Some people felt like, yeah, sure, protect minors, protect vulnerable populations, but also a lot of people were more like, oh, is this gonna infringe on our privacy when it came to collecting information for age verification? So I think the key theme that a lot of people in the technical committee raised was that age verification, yes, it needs to be implemented in a manner that protects the rights and best interests of children, but it also has to be equitable. It also has to be privacy preserved and be secure too. And so this was the scope of the standard that we ultimately arrived in. You will see that there were a bunch of other different standards that have been built in the international space. So when it comes to domestic standards, it's really important that we don't duplicate other standards that have been developed already. And so we do our due diligence during the proposal stage, that we make sure what other standards are out there in other countries, and really determine if there is a need for it to continue being built in Canada, or can we just duplicate the one internationally and use it here? In this case, we felt that because we have different federal, provincial, and municipal requirements for age restriction here in Canada, the technical committee did determine, yes, there is a need specifically to have a domestic standard. And so this is some of the considerations here, apart from the federal, provincial, municipal requirements, was they wanted to determine the level of risks that different services can pose. And so if you look at the standard, it does break down the different levels of risk, but it also identifies at the different levels of risk then what kind of age assurance can be conducted. Because sometimes age assurance methods can range from really ineffective to just asking you about your birthday and then you just key in a fake date. or it can be extremely intrusive and ask for things like biometrics. So specifically, this standard kind of laid out the many different levels and also just provided more clarity on the different kinds of age assurance. So that's the second use case. The third one is around data governance for community and human services. So this one specifically was really helpful in the non-for-profit space because it really helped a lot of organizations, specifically NPOs, make sure that their data can now be interoperable because there is one data governance standard that is developed for the sector. And if you're familiar with the NPO space, there is a data deficit in that sector sometimes. So even if there is data, it's very disorganized and it's very hard to actually garner value add from the data. And so this was a policy lever that was really effective in this space because it helped promote technical interoperability, and it also ensured that the data quality is good enough for program evaluation and also funding in the future. So this one came about actually quite a few years ago from a whole bunch of different NPOs that started working together. So you see here, there's the Ontario Nonprofit Network, the Ontario Cherlene Foundation, Canadian Mental Health Association, etc. These were members of the technical committee, but also the expert drafting team that came together to draft this standard. But a bunch of these folks were actually people that back in 2022, they felt like there was this need already to start having more data equity in the sector. And so they came forward saying, we think there is a need for this standard to be built. Specifically, you'll see as well, the name of the standard is 100-11 because it is the 11th standard in the series on data governance. So we realize that in the field of data governance, it really can benefit from different applications and not just a broad data governance standard that could apply to any sector. And so the other standards that we have developed relate to health data. It also relates to specific governance of employee information. And then this one specifically focused on community and human services. Here, we also met up with, I think it was 260 members in the technical committee. And this is one of the bigger technical committees that we have because data governance, I think, as a topic of interest has been around for quite a few years. So when it came to this topic, a lot of people also showed interest. And then, as you can see, a whole bunch of the NPOs specifically showed interest as well. And again, the scope of this standard, this one specifically talks about minimum requirements. Again, privacy preserving keeps coming up, and it is very key in a whole bunch of our standards, but this one specifically focused on different parts of the data lifecycle for non-for-profits. And it was helpful for a lot of these small and medium-sized organizations that don't have the resources per se, or even the training sometimes to understand how to apply data governance principles. And so here I wanted to talk about the concept of data equity, because I remember that at the beginning of the work done on this standard, the technical committee really stressed the importance of not developing a whole new standard and almost adding more barriers to this space, especially because I think NPOs have a lot of other priorities that they're already trying to grapple with, things like trying to find funding. They didn't want to add more burden to the space and say, okay, this is a completely new standard that now you have to abide by. And so they really wanted to stress that when it came to data equity, they recognized the harms that have already been done to communities, like Black and Indigenous communities and things like that. And so they really stressed that when it came to the creation of this standard, they wanted to work off other existing frameworks already. So for instance, the First Nations OCAP principles, that was really key. And then also the City of Toronto's community data governance framework was another reference point that they kind of leveraged on. And so ultimately, I think it really helped because at every stage of the life cycle, starting from just governance and oversight, which is very much your big umbrella where all the principles of governance should apply to every step of the data collection life cycle. And then it then moved on to requirements in data collection, data storage, data access and use, and finally data sharing and publishing. So this one, I think when it came to policy levers, because it just got published in early May, we did notice that it was really helpful that websites like Charity Village already started talking about this standard because we did see an uptick in the number of downloads in the first 2 weeks. We will see if this trend continues in the next few months. But I think, especially in the not-for-profit sector, I was at a social economy conference last weekend. And when you're at conferences like that, you do realize how much NPOs have to collaborate with each other because they all face similar challenges. And so things like this standard, I think, really help to kind of create some sense of collaboration between NPOs. And so recap, if you forgot the first two use cases, but transparency, accountability, and policy levers. And then I think this slide, I just wanted to say, these are the different areas that you can get involved. So it's great that you folks are already here because I think like I've been to the Hacknights too, and there's a lot of different projects that are happening. Other ways that you could potentially think of contributing would be the expert drafting team. So we do have an expert drafting team, as I mentioned previously, when it comes to, if you don't just want to be a part of this huge 260 member technical committee, and you want to actually play a part in penning the standard, this is where you can show more interest and be a part of the drafting team. Or you can be a part of the technical committee too. I think it's a really good learning opportunity, especially if you are interested in a lot of different areas of digital governance and you don't really have much background in them. I think this is a good way of just even getting your foot in the door and seeing what is actually being discussed in our current society. And then lastly, if you don't want to be a member of the technical committee or the drafting team, you can participate in public review as a member of the public. So get involved, and specifically, these are the technical committees that you can really get involved in. So the ones that I talked about, they range from TC1, that's data governance, and then I think I talked about age assurance as TC18, and online voting would be TC11, but you can also look at all the other TCs as well. Thank you.
All right. Does anyone in the room have a question?
Thanks so much for the presentation. I was hoping you could tell us more about what makes DGSI take on a standard versus a body like ISO or W3C.
So I also had that same question at first because I think I'm more of a realist when I joined the organization. And so I was wondering to myself, like, well, if there are ISO IEC standards already, what's the point of a DGSI standard? And I realized that a huge proportion of the organizations in Canada, well, it's not new information, but a lot of these organizations are small and medium sized. And when I actually spoke to a lot of these organizations, the ISO IEC standards were, first of all, too costly. And they also were too comprehensive. Because some of these shops, these like mom and pop shops or medium enterprises, they aren't looking for complex cybersecurity requirements to abide by. They are looking for just baseline ones that they can afford and actually implement practically. And so this is where the standards like the DGSI standard, I think it kind of fits that niche market where it's not necessarily supposed to be used like by the metas, but it's used by the smaller and medium organizations in Canada.
Is there a question online? Any other questions in the room? I think I saw that hand.
Actually,
Thank you for the talk. I do wonder, like some of the topics have been very controversial, like online electoral voting. I'm wondering if the technical committees would have, in some topics, reach a conclusion that no, this is impossible to do with respect to privacy and stuff, or it has to be, yeah, you can do it provided you have done something, we have to make it work. Like how what's the flexibility of the committee on this kind of stuff?
Yeah. I think that's why some of these standards actually took quite a while to build out because sometimes, especially in standards, or if some of you are familiar with just the policy space, there can be so much debate on one word. And one specific word can actually take a few months just to go through to define. And so there are contentious cases sometimes where there is disagreement within the technical committee. But for like my role is specifically to facilitate those meetings and actually come to consensus. And so it does happen, but in those cases, we just work through it. And there are cases sometimes where the members do leave because they find that, oh, there's not much Like they really believe in something a lot more stringent than what is being discussed. And so it's their prerogative to make that choice. But for the most part, like for us, I think there have been many rounds of technical committee reviews sometimes because some people aren't satisfied with the quality of the standard. And there are pros and cons to that too, because, well, if there are multiple levels of review or multiple rounds of review, it could take a very long time. But ultimately, I think it does contribute to the quality of the standard when there are so many eyes on it. So I do personally appreciate the standards that are more contentious.
Awesome. Is there any questions online? If not, we'll do.
I had a question personally, which I wanted to ask in. So if in case any of your audits or any of your standards are set up, how does one engage into an audit with you, like with those standards particularly? Or do we need to engage with another organization to be able to get ourselves audited?
I just realized the comment was coming from Zoom. I was trying to find the person.
No, I'm online. I'm online.
So I think your question was about audits and reviews, right?
So you have set a standard per se. Now, if in case someone wants his application or something else to be audited, is it you that will be audited by that standard with referencing that standard, or will it be another organization that will be doing it? And if so, which ones?
So there are a bunch of different organizations actually that could do the audits and reviews. It is a separate branch in our organization now that we've just created a year ago, and that's the validation and verification branch. So I don't know if you all are familiar with typical terms like audits, reviews, but essentially validation is assessing the plausibility that a standard will be fulfilled in the future, whereas verification assesses that the standard has already been done in the past. So think about it as organizations at different stages of their maturity journey. Say an organization has already drafted specific cybersecurity policies, but they haven't actually implemented it. That's when they get validated for that standard. Or if they have already implemented it, then they would go for a verification kind of audit or review. But there are a few organizations that do audit and review in alignment with these standards, specifically for our side as well. Apart from standards development, we have that independent validation and verification branch as well that would conduct these audits and reviews. And so one thing we also wanted to stress when it came to those reviews and audits, we didn't want to position them at a very high cost because like what I said to your answer, to your question earlier, some of these audits for the ISO IEC standards, they can cost up to like more than $20,000 sometimes. And so for our audits and reviews, we price them very much affordably at $250 or like $750 because we wanted to, again, ease that barrier, especially for the smaller organization.
Amazing. That's something spectacular. Is it possible that we also can be a part? If any of our members over here can also be a part of your audit validation or even the committees?
Oh, yes, definitely. So if you are interested, just reach out. I think my email was provided, but if it wasn't, feel free to talk to me after this.
Okay, I'll ask for it online.
One last question in the room.
So when you talk about it being an effective policy lever, what's the relationship to policy of these kinds of standards? Like, are there enforcement mechanisms, or is it more informing, policies eventually? Or I'm just kind of curious what that relationship is like.
I'll give an example. So we had a different standard, and this was around housing, and specifically the government or the the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. They came to us saying, "Hey, can you build a standard specifically in streamlining data in planning and housing applications?" And so in this case, a part of me also, when I first heard about the project, I was curious because I'm thinking, well, if you're government, surely you can, move ahead policy and you don't really have to depend on standards. And so in this case, to be upfront, standards are not mandatory in Canada. So that's the main difference between standards and law, because law is obviously mandatory. But I think that's why I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation in terms of the agility of policy sometimes. If you're, I guess, familiar with how government or like Canadian government works, a lot of the time policymakers want to show that they are doing something. Even if it might take years, they want to show in their short 1 year, 2 year timeline that they have some sort of framework. And so in this case, I think standards really help in terms of having this framework that they can show stakeholders that, hey, there is something that we are building towards. And then in the future years, the law itself would then be leveraging the existing standards that do exist.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.